A very good afternoon to all. The two days of the conference gave us an opportunity to discuss 18 research papers that had been shortlisted after a rigorous review process. It is now time to reflect on the key themes that emerge from these papers and bring to the notice of policymakers and practitioners so that these become part of the ongoing policy debates and academic research turns to be fruitful for practice and policy, the very objective of this conference. We are more than privileged to have 6 eminent dignitaries with us who are on boards of various committees and have been shaping the infrastructure policies in the country. We also have industry and consulting experts in the panel who have been shaping the infrastructure business landscape. There could not have been a better opportunity than this to deliberate on the themes that emerged during the conference. It is my privilege to introduce the panel members. I am humbled to introduce Professor G. Raghuram, who has been a constant support to us for this conference. He is the former director of IIM Bangalore and currently the principal academic advisor for National Rail and Transport Institute. Professor Raghuram specializes in infrastructure and transport systems and logistics and supply chain management. He has served on various government policy making and advisory committees for the Ministry of Civil Aviation, Ministry of Consumer Affairs and Public Distribution, Ministry of Railways, Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, and many other committees. Professor Raghuram has written extensively over 150 case studies, 6 books, and many working papers. He has a PhD from Northwestern University, USA, and a PGDM from IIM Ahmedabad. Sir, it is a pleasure to have you and chair this eminent panel. It's an honor to welcome Mr. R.V. Shahi, who is the chairman of Energy Infratech Private Limited, an engineering and project development consulting company. He previously served as the Secretary to Government of India in Ministry of Power and formerly the Chairman and Managing Director of Bombay Suburban Electric Supply Limited. Mr. Shahi was responsible for major restructuring of the Indian power industry through implementation of legislative policy initiatives like National Electricity Policy and Electricity Tariff Policy. We are pleased to have you, sir, on this panel. We are humbled to have Mr. Ajay Shankar, who is a distinguished fellow of TERI. Mr. Shankar has over 45 years of rich experience, primarily in the fields of power sector and urban development. He has served on the boards of major public sector companies and also served in the Government of India in key policy-making positions in the area of industry and energy. He played a key role in piloting the reform legislation, the Electricity Act 2003, and the major program for completing the universalization of electricity access launched in 2005 to electrify 125,000 villages. He was closely involved in the design of the National Solar Mission at the time of its inception. He was the CEO of Noida Industrial Development Policy. We heartily welcome you, sir. We are also pleased to have the presence of Mr. Sunil Srivastava ji, who is a retired Deputy Managing Director of Corporate Banking in State Bank of India with over 38 years of experience in credit risk, project finance, corporate finance, international banking, investment banking, corporate strategy, and digital and retail banking. Currently, he is the Senior Advisor for the World Bank Group, Senior Advisor at Edelweiss Financial Services, Independent Director at Security and Intelligence Services, India. So it's a pleasure to have you on the board. We now invite Mr. Anish, who is Director of KPMG, has over 24 years of experience. He specializes in the field of energy, market design, regulation, pricing, energy trading, renewable energy, and fuels, etc. He has played an active role in policy formulation and has contributed to the development of the National Electricity Policy. Mr. Day joined KPMG in 2014. Since then, he has been leading the strategy and operations practice in infrastructure, government, and healthcare. and the oil and gas sector for KPMG in India. Mr. Day has conceptualized and authored thought leadership publications on energy pricing, gas market development, and pooling, renewable energy integration, etc. Welcome, Mr. Day. Our next panel member is Mr. Kuljeet Singh, the partner and head of infrastructure investment banking at EY. He has 27 years of experience in the infrastructure space. He specializes in mergers and acquisitions, private fundraise, investment infrastructure trusts, bid advisory in energy and transportation infrastructure sectors in India, covering areas such as renewable energy, transmission, distribution, highways, construction, water, aviation, railways, etc. He is a postgraduate in Master of Finance program from Delhi University. He has written several thought leadership articles and has been a speaker in several conferences on infrastructure sector in India. Welcome, Mr. Singh. Pleased to have you on this panel. I would now invite Professor Astha Agarwala to present the key themes emerging from the research papers. Over to you, Astha.
Thank you, Professor Rachna. It has been an enriching 2 days, seeing so many young minds digging into the possibilities of making an impact on the climate and environment, bringing the sustainability debate to the forefront, as you rightly said. And there has always been a discomfort, a hush-hush sort of contention between academia and industry, with the feeling that these two do not interact as much as they should. The phrases such as armchair research or ivory tower research, they sort of show what I'm trying to say, that academic research is often blamed to be too theoretical, ignoring the policy implications or not looking at the industrial perspective or the usefulness for the industry. So we thought that this conference gives us an opportunity to take a step in this direction, and we are very fortunate. Like Professor Rachna introduced our distinguished panel, we thought let us have the doers, the people who are there, very distinguished people who can make an impact, people who are decision makers, who are influencers, to have them here and to present to them the key themes that emerge out of this conference, so that we hope that some of these themes will will come in the forefront of the policy debates and would be translated into industry practices over the years. So with this, and we are very thankful to Professor Raghuram for his guidance, I'll quickly present the key themes, and then we'll request Professor Raghuram to take it forward from there. So when we sort of looked at all the papers together, very, very interesting 17 papers. Is my screen visible? Let me start sharing my screen. When we looked at the key themes that have emerged from the conference, we could group the papers into three main categories, three main baskets. Some studies have tried to look at what it is that we need to change. That gives us the future agenda. What are the things that we can do differently? What are the things that we can look at differently? Then there are some studies that take it to the next level, to the how part of it, procedural changes or operational changes that we can look at to make the impact that is desired. And last but not the least, knowing what we have to do and how we have to do, it is always important to keep taking stock of the things and to measure the outcomes, ensuring that we achieve the what through the how, and we knowing why are we doing it. So let me very briefly talk about some interesting studies that have allowed us to look at these. For example, when we try to look at the papers that talk about the what part, the thrust areas that emerge, one of the thrust areas is the need to focus on the human face of infrastructure provisioning. to look at the people to whom we are trying to make an impact. There's an interesting study by CEPT University, Professor Madhu Bharti. She looks at the need for providing affordable housing to industrial workers. Then there is a study which looks at gender discrimination in private health expenditure in India. There was a very interesting study presented today that talks about student perception on campuses. So the idea is that we need to look at the stakeholders, the last mile, the consumers or the people of the country who are impacted by this. Then the other the what aspect or the things that we need to do differently are we need to look at more local solutions. So some papers talked about looking at rural and urban differently and coming up with technological solutions differently for rural and urban areas. For example, a very interesting study from BHU talked about sustainability and resilience of the economic transformation in rural India. Then there was a case study on agrovoltaic technology from BJTI Mumbai, and a very interesting paper from NIT Hamirpur talking about rejuvenating a water canal in Kochi, Kerala. So we need to be more local, we need to be more focused and look at local solutions to make a greater impact. Then coming to the process part of it, how do we do it? So therefore, the technological solutions appear at the forefront. There was a very interesting study looking at blending ash and basalt fibers along with cement to make it more sustainable. Another study tried to look at, this study was by people from NICMAR, University of Lisbon, Liverpool University. They presented yesterday. Then we had this paper from IIT Guwahati talking about hybrid infrastructure for effective sustainable growth. We need to look at multimodal, we need to look at hybrid solutions. There was an interesting paper from MNIT Jaipur talking about the potentialities of intelligent transport systems. So that to improve the transportation facility, they looked at Lucknow city particularly. This can be then tried and applied on other cities as well. And then today we had a study from Facto College talking about fuel of the future, the options that we have. Another procedural change that is required and much talked about is the need to finance infrastructure, and there to typically finance private infrastructure. There's a study presented from IIT Patna looking at how do we look at private infrastructure financing through PPPs. They looked at renewable energy and transport projects particularly. Coming to impact measurement studies, there were two such studies looking at impact of our current activity on the economy and the sustainability. The first study from Kannavati University that was just presented before this panel looked at impact of renewable energy on Indian economy. And the other study from School of Planning and Architecture, Vijayawada, looked at how do people perceive the weather changes, again in the Lucknow city, and what impact does it make, how does it impact their choices. So the hows and how are they impacting, the measurement part is important. Another very interesting study from IIT Bombay presented yesterday talked about looking at regulations and using simulation to look at how regulations make an impact. Typically for sustainability of buildings, they did it. Another study from IIT Bombay looked at evolution of electric mobility policy in India. How has the policy impacted the outcomes in the transport as well as energy sector? And then there was another study from IIT Madras that looked at trade facilitation and global value chain participation. Again, an impact on cross-country as to how do we make an impact. So these are some of the key themes that have emerged from the discussions. Now, I request Professor Raghuram to take it forward to the distinguished panel to brainstorm and give their insights and views on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Asta, and thank you, Rachna, for the introductions. I think it was a good sort of crystallization of the main academic content of this conference. Of course, there were a few keynotes too, but largely revolving around these themes. So I guess you really want us to have a discussion on, some sort of a way forward. And so I'm really happy that we have this very sort of enlightened panel with Mr. Shahi and Anish and Mr. Sunil Srivastava, Ajay Shankar and Kuljit. There is a sort of, we have people from who have been with the government, maybe continuing to be active with some, non-government involvement. Then people from, KPMG, EY. Right. So, and of course, from bank, from the state bank. And well, you can sort of throw in for flavor an academic here. Fine. So we thought, just based on the themes, not necessarily to force fit any structure, but just to enable, more as an enabling mechanism. We thought some of the papers kind of addressed, what should be the sort of dimensions of focus in infrastructure, where I think the human face and the localized, can, instead of sort of, obviously large scale cross-country infrastructure projects will anyway be there, but probably in the context of sustainability, you need to also focus on infrastructure by giving emphasis to the local. So I think that's what came out. And if we look at how, I just say two things that stood out is, one is, can we use technology? And I'm glad that technology didn't simply mean, IT. And, today very often we sort of say technology means IT. No, I think it, in fact, focused also on materials and construction management. And, and I think these are hardcore basic issues around technology. And, I think so that's the how part. With the financing, of course, I think the most critical part is financing. And the third dimension was really on impact assessment, to know, are we headed in the direction for which the infrastructure was meant to be, or if there was any regulation to sort of direct that infrastructure. So keeping that in mind, how, impact assessments, so that, we are sort of moving in the direction that, we need to be. So I think these were the three themes, and we sort of requested, out of the five, I mean, two in the what and one, Mr. Shrivastava in the how, and then Mr. Ajay Shankar and Kuljit in the impact assessment. So what we're going to do is just, the ground rules are, we'll sort of take 5 to 6 minutes kind of time. Again, as I said, you don't have to compartmentalize yourself to that, but it is just an enabler. And after we do one round of this, then if there's anything to sort of summarize, I will do that. Then we'll get some questions. By the time as audience questions come in, we have Ketan, who's, I think, given how AIM has decided, they will prioritize a few questions, which I would get access to. And then we'll sort of throw those questions at the panelists and take it from there. So I think the target is to close by 5:15, 5:20. That's the time frame. Am I okay on that, Rachna and Asta, in terms of the time? I think then you need some time to finish your final session. Great. So I would request Mr. Shahi to please be the opening bat. Yeah. You have to unmute. You have to unmute, Mr. Shahi.
Thank you, Professor Raghuram. And of course, I must be thankful to the Adani Institute of Infrastructure, the Institute of Management, and the Management Institute. Professor Astha gave a very detailed analysis of what has gone into this conference. I must say, I must compliment. It's a very innovative way of trying to integrate some of the academic studies, research studies that have been done, to also see how best findings of these studies could be related to what we need to do in a futuristic way. And obviously, the studies must have found out some of the gaps that might have happened in the past, so that they show some direction, some conclusion as to how we should move around. And infrastructure, of course, has been an issue. Infrastructure has been the issue for India. It's not now. It's when we were students, infrastructure was the issue. And then when we were teachers, infrastructure was the issue. When we were administrators, the infrastructure has been the issue and continues to be the issue. And in that, certain nice dimensions have been brought about: rural, urban, gender discrimination, etc., etc. I think these are very important issues, and we should struggle to see how the futures. We should try to design things and work towards, so that see, one of the points always which is made is that we need not, and why not also, compare ourselves with some of the very highly developed nations which developed from 19th century, from 18th century, and they had the long history of development. But one of the obvious examples for the two large nations that come to mind is that as late as 1988-89, India and China were at par. And now, in a period of 30 years, just 30 years, see the differences in anything and in everything, infrastructure. Largely populated countries, very large, like China and India, we have almost, they are a little larger than us. But then in a period of 30 years, so I think the period under which we have been focusing on these issues, we really need to, and I think academic research that has been carried out and will be carried out in the future, it is, we should bring it out. It is no satisfaction that we say that we are a highly democratic country and China is a little different type of system of governance, and therefore explain all the gaps and all the deficiencies, all the problems that we have by just one statement that yes, it is only the system of governance which was responsible here and which is responsible there, and therefore that issue has come. We are still struggling. When I joined, Ajay is here. We work together, Ajay Shankar. And the census of 2001 or something had come out. And in that census, even after more than 45 years of independence, 60% of rural India just did not have access to electricity. Did not have access. In a village, when you have one light and one bulb, then we said that is the electrified village. That is the definition we were carrying out till as late as 2002, 3, 4. But we had to change. And electricity is at the core of infrastructure, at the core of development. All types of it. Not only economic development, development of a good education infrastructure, development of a good health infrastructure, almost anything. And that was the situation. And the 40% that had, it had electricity connection only for namesake. Electricity will not be there. Maybe there for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours will not be there. So that was the fate of that's a good case. I wouldn't say that's a good case because we were associated with this. We found out so many issues in this. And one of the important issues that we found out was that you provide the fund, but states are unable to utilize the fund. So the capability of the state on a proper project management, on a transparent system of this, on an accountable system, with the quality, with the safety, that was the main gap. One of the problems that we found in the system of administration and development of infrastructure was that we make the policy and we do post-mortem of the study or a scheme, after this whole scheme is over, 5 years, 10 years. So we introduced the system and we brought some of the institutions, including academic institutions, to study just after 1 year of this scheme having been introduced to find out how best we should move forward, how best we should correct the scheme, the modality, the procedure, the process, so that it delivers. I think we are very much off on this, on the infrastructure of housing. That is one of the points that has been brought out in the study, housing for the poor people. And I will also say that its question in India in infrastructure is not only between rural and urban. Right in Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, one of the authors brought two India A and India B. And now I think the problem is also urban and urban. Difference between urban, one set of urban, migrant level in the COVID situation, that issue has brought out very clearly on the fore. That issue is not divide between rural and urban India, which is very much there. Issue is also between urban A and urban B. Some of the people who don't have houses, the whole thing came out so clearly. They can't afford to stay. They want to run away. And when they run away, the whole system of municipal work stops, services stop. So they are so vital for the development, vital for the services, essential. But then they run away, then how do you go on? I think that is an important issue. Many areas we have to if I list out what we have done, being associated in many ways, directly or indirectly, in many of the things, we have also done a lot. We have developed connectivity, road infrastructure, highway infrastructure, the metros. So if you list what India has done, there will be a long list and there can be a book on this. But the outcome of all this is that we are going to, we are celebrating 75th year of our independence this year, 2021-22. And in that, we have very major issues, particularly in rural India. We have issue of health infrastructure. We have issue of education infrastructure. Even now, connectivity is not that dependable and not that quality. So therefore, these are the issues which come to our mind. Gender, and again, we have done a lot. If we say there is always two half, people will say glass is half empty or half full. I can definitely say that one does not have to feel that nothing has been done, but one should aspire to do things and one should envision things to do. If something has been achieved elsewhere, why can it not be achieved in our context? And it is that which should guide us in the future, that, and there are lessons and lessons and lessons. Do things in the manner that things can be faster. I will come to a point when technology is also being discussed, but for the present, within the time frame that you have, I think that is what I will like as initial comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shahi. I now request Anish to...
Thank you, Professor Raghuram.
Yes.
I hope I'm audible to you.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for having me. I think it's a very interesting conference. And this time carrying on 2 days of intense discussions when the mind is focused on other things is difficult, but it is also good because it takes the mind away from the pandemic, which is raging all around, and brings us back to things which will stay with us. And infrastructure, as all of us know, stays for a very long time. So we need to do it the right way, build it the right way, and to that extent that the work AIIM is doing to kind of ignite the minds, create strong minds. I think it's very, it's very commendable. So just I was hearing the themes which were covered through the papers, through the 17 papers, and it just struck me that some of them are very related and relatable and related. And I was just looking at local solutions, sustainability, sustainable cement, which is a very interesting thing. We could talk about that. Fuel of the future, climate change, regulatory impacts. And when you start looking at these are individual areas which are in themselves very important. But then when you start piecing them together, you see that there is convergence between them. They're related areas, and they are in this new age where they're all converging. In fact, not just these. to other parts of infrastructure. The physical infrastructure converges with digital infrastructure. Your renewable energy and the demand side and supply side of energy are converging very quickly through new technologies like hydrogen and others, battery storage and so on. EVs are playing a big part in this, which you have a paper also on. So it's a study in itself that how these 17 papers which have been presented are actually coming to some very, very close interlocks and interlinkages. And if somebody can look at that thing and see how they relate to each other and what they mean together, I think that will be very interesting, because otherwise they all capture some very important relatable things. Now, I'm going to come back to the theme of convergence, but I'm also going to pick up some other themes which emerge out of all of these when you start looking at that. First is, of course, let's look at how infrastructure has changed, and Mr. Shahi covered some of that, of course, through his deep experience. He's seen that. But if we look at just the era in the last 70 years since the Second World War, after which we have not had major kind of global events of that nature of war. I mean, there have been wars, but not that scale. We've seen unprecedented prosperity across the world. And in India also, over a period of time, we have seen that prosperity come. In the post-independence, of course, it took its time, but in the 90s and post the 90s, we have seen that come in and create a large consuming class. We've also seen the advance of technology in a very big way, the physical technology as well as digital technology more recently in a very big way. Telecommunications has been the backbone. So the telecommunications infrastructure has created many more things, or enabled many more things which could not have been done earlier. Consequence of that is that the living standards have improved and the demands of the consumers have tremendously changed. And that's led to a very high level of consumption. So the average sizes of the houses we live in today are way different from, and even the rich or the middle class, the sizes they live in. I'm leaving Mumbai out of the equation for the moment, but otherwise generally tends to be larger and so on and so forth. So the whole attitude towards quality consumption has increased. But is this going to be the future? And that's where we are seeing some breaks coming in now. I mean, Corona, of course, is a different kind of break. I'll talk about it because these may not be such one-off things. Not just Corona, but disruptions may not be such one-off things. But more importantly, we are seeing a very, very here and now disruption from climate change. And that, I have statistics to show. I've written about it quite frequently with public data to show that we are seeing unprecedented changes, and this will only get worse. And as the world heads towards whatever you say, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees higher, 1.5 degrees higher, 2 degrees higher, or more than that, which is also possible as compared to the earlier pre-industrial age temperatures. This is inevitable, and we have seen, even if you see our country, the Eastern Seaboard gets affected regularly by weather events. Our summers are getting hotter and hotter, and more extreme droughts are happening. If you see US, between snowstorms in odd places which have never seen snow or hardly have ever seen snow, to wildlife, forest fires, all kinds of things happening at enormous frequency. So this is the kind of change which is happening. We have to live with that change, and our new age infrastructure has to prepare for that change. Similarly, the digital infrastructure, which didn't exist possibly in any scale till about 20, 30 years ago, today has become the backbone as much as the physical infrastructure. And it also sees that kind of disruption, very, very frequent disruptions. And we are unable to kind of deal with those disruptions because we have become so dependent on the digital infrastructure as well. The social infrastructure, which had progressed in these ages of prosperity, had progressed. But today, we see that the social infrastructure is a combination of some of these disruptions also getting disrupted quite frequently. Because if we have droughts coming in, then people move, people migrate, that disrupts the whole social change, social order. Urbanization, as we have seen, is sometimes disruptive, and it goes against the grain of local solutions which we talked about, because urbanization means that we hardly can have local solutions. So that is one thing which is happening. one change which we are looking at, which we have to build the future infrastructure for, that it is not got to be built for the previous era's demands. It actually has to be built for the next era's demands. But how it is built becomes very different from previous era to next era. I'll just give one example which will be very easily relatable. Take the electricity network, the distribution network. Now, we hardly had any underground network except in a few of the major metros, and even there, that's sometimes patchy. If you go forward, for the future, for the network to be secure, you will possibly have to take much of the network underground, because otherwise overground cables are going to be affected through weather events much more than underground cables. Not that underground won't be affected, but you can secure it better. But that means redoing the whole network, that means a lot higher costs, which sometimes consumers are not willing to bear. So that preparedness, and I'm just talking of one sphere, if you start extending this to other spheres, the infrastructure of the future actually has very different implications from the infrastructure of the past in terms of how it is built, how it is priced, what is the cost element, all of that becomes different. The second, I bring back my point on the service aspects. Okay. So earlier infrastructure, it used to be built for just bare connectivity. The light bulb which Mr. Shahi talked about is just about reaching the thing out. But today's customer doesn't want that. They want service. So rather than looking infrastructure as a physical asset, consumers are looking infrastructure as a service. And I think that is a big mindset change for the infrastructure players. So to be sub-service oriented, to see how the consumer is served better. So for example, toll roads. Okay, if you look at the toll roads or roads in particular, the quality of the roads have improved, but the tolling had not. So today, when a consumer uses it, they are expecting the world-class tolling systems, and the country has to provide that. And eventually, we are going to, completely toll gate-free systems in the next couple of years, hopefully, if Mr. Gadkari has his way. So there's a big service orientation which is coming as compared to the physical infrastructure orientation alone. So those are the kind of big changes happening. The infrastructure of the future has to be built for the future, and it has to be built for the consumer who will consume that service in a very, very different way. So, what I will leave with you is those two themes, and one is convergence. The second is service, which has to be the focus rather than the physical infrastructure. But the bigger theme, underlying theme, which I talked about is resilience, because the infrastructure of the future has to be resilient to the effects of climate and other changes, which today it may not be. So I think I'll leave my opening comments there and come back maybe with follow-ons on how some ideas about how we could go about it if time permits. Professor Raghuram.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll move on to Mr. Sunil Srivastava. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's been my privilege to be with you people to discuss some of the very topical issues which have gained increased relevance post-COVID. But I'm in August company. I'm not so enlightened, so please excuse me for my lack of erudition. But I'll focus myself on the practical aspects which I have, as in the State Bank of India, I've had to go through, and maybe try and suggest some solutions for debate. The fact of the matter is that post-COVID, we need to kickstart our economy. And the multiplier will come from infrastructure. So that's a no-brainer. Now, we made mistakes in the infrastructure in the past. Shahi was leading the electricity power efforts when he was Secretary Power. And, we actually financed a lot of these power companies from State Bank of India. But today we have a situation where we have around 368 gigawatts of installed capacity, but the PLF is less than 60%. So there has been certain levels of imbalances. There have been mistakes also made. Frankly, the project design, the planning, and the contracts and the enforcement of the contracts and dispute resolutions topics which I would not like to expand on. But the fact of the matter is that going forward with the increasing population, which is expected to touch 1.52 billion by 2030, average age being 31, people living longer, people migrating from rural to urban areas, obviously the need for infrastructure will go up. Now, if the need for infrastructure will go up, there has to be some means of financing it. And unfortunately, we do not seem to have too much of fiscal space to finance it. And the banks have also burnt their fingers in the last time around. Well, almost 30% of the infrastructure financing went bust. I remember there are 34 power projects in various stages of incompletion. And out of that, only 7 or 8 have been resolved. The rest are actually yet being implemented, not being implemented in football fields, some of them. So frankly, mistakes were made all around, and we have lessons to learn from these mistakes and to ensure that we don't commit them in future, similar mistakes in future. Now, I'll look at, the mistakes that banks made. Banks have been, and I was part of it, so I'm admitting to the mistakes that we made. Frankly, we didn't have the experience to handle project finance. And we saw some sort of, confused between corporate finance and project finance. Banks had been in corporate finance post 1990, and this was basically on the back of balance sheet financing, sponsor support, and sort of a reliance on the names. And these same names came for project financing. So the banks had a great reliance that, okay, even if approvals and clearances are not there, as hitherto before, these would also be sorted out as the project goes along. Unfortunately, they were not. And the contracts and the dispute resolution mechanism and the payment delays actually compounded the problem to such an extent that for the next 5-6 years, the bank shied away from getting into any infrastructure projects. I won't comment on whether it was right or wrong. The fact of the matter is that if they burn their fingers, definitely they will not get into that field again. Now, given that situation, obviously, if you are looking at funding, the Development Financial Institutions Bill talks about 111 lakh crore pipeline of national infrastructure pipeline, and 75% of that is to be funded by the banks. You need to have the wherewithal to finance that. The total banking sector exposure on infrastructure has been only to the extent of 10 lakh crore, out of which 30% became an NPA. So even if you are looking at incremental funding, you'll probably get a 1 lakh crore, which is also doubtful that they will not be so forthcoming. And the fear is obviously the banks will not take the risks which they faced last time around. And there are several examples where risks were misallocated. So going this time around, the banks are very, very careful. Now, if that is the situation, we have to distinguish it between the construction phase of a project and the operation phase of a project. While we see a lot of liquidity sloshing around the globe, and we see investments coming in the InvITs or the REITs or the TOT projects being taken over by sovereign funds or pension funds and infra funds, there's very little money or appetite for the construction phase. Now, where does that money come from? So that we'll have to distinguish that till we are able to establish institutions and the regulatory framework, which includes not only a very robust project design and planning, which is absolutely distinct from the DPRs made at L1 biddings in the past. And the lowest bidding was not of the highest quality, of course. And then you had very weak monitoring infrastructure. You didn't have definition of standards. And that has undermined the confidence which the banks have in the implementation of the project. Coupled with the fact that today you do not have the EPC companies which will implement these projects. We had a lot of companies in Hyderabad. Unfortunately, all of them have been referred to NCLT and gone bust, barely surviving. Lack of capital and lack of capability. So how do you get this infrastructure kick-started? Now, obviously the institutions and the regulatory framework, dispute resolution, contract resolution, monitoring, interministerial group. But one point which I can take a cue from what Mr. Sai mentioned or Mr. Anish Day mentioned was that you need to get the stakeholder convergence. Being a investment banker myself in my earlier avatar, a deal happens when the interest of all stakeholders converge. Unfortunately, you have situations where you have the bullet train running from Mumbai to Ahmedabad, with the Ahmedabad end being under implementation and the Mumbai part being stalled. So somewhere there is a incongruity in the project planning. There's an uneven planning, lack of coordination. So I guess the first thing would be to identify projects which are of national importance. Get the stakeholders convergence onto that, the center, state, or even the local government. Help them build the capacity to implement and monitor projects, and then get the banks to fund it, which will inspire confidence. Now banks, so I'm going to be placing an alternate means of financing. So please indulge with me for 1 or 2 minutes and dismiss it if you think it's outlandish. Frankly, if you ask the banks to finance infrastructure, participate in infrastructure financing these days, they will support only the large corporates, be it the L&T or the Adanis or the others. They will not finance, they will not be willing to support the smaller. The smaller ones don't have the capacity and not have the capital. But we require a large ecosystem in which there are multiple players. Now, what if we reverse the onus of the payment risk? Instead of, I'll take an example for the road sector to make it easier. Instead of the contractor submitting the bid bond and the advance payment guarantee and the performance guarantee and the retention guarantee and then not being paid and the guarantees being invoked and his account becoming an NPA, after the bid bond stage, after the technical and financial bids have been opened and it's been awarded, what if we reverse the entire thing and let NHI open the letter of credit in favor of the EPC contractor for the period of construction plus 1 year? And based on milestone achievements per standards defined in the bid document, which are monitored and measured independently for quality, cost, time, whatever standards, bills could be submitted and discounted by the banks for the balanced tenure of the project, which means implementation plus 1 year, progressively at each milestone. And at the end of the milestone, because this risk would be on NHI, the banks would be forthcoming to take this risk. Since it will be non-fund based, the capital adequacy will be low. And since the discounting will be on NHI, the pricing would be lower. And the projects would be completed faster because the velocity of capital will be faster with the EPC companies. And at the end of the period, you can recycle the capital, put it in the InvIT, or sell it as a TOT, and liquidate the outstanding bills at the end of the implementation plus 1 year period. Now we'll have to think out of the box till our institutions and regulatory standards stabilize. Till that time, we may be saying that the world has a lot of funds, but the funds are looking at stable returns, predictable returns, the safety of their money, and appropriate returns, balanced with risk. So till that time, we actually mature as an economy, we will have these problems. And during this period, we cannot just hope that, okay, things will take off on their own. So maybe we'll need to think out of the box and think alternatively. I'll rest here. And
thank you very much. We will. I would now request Mr. Ajay Shankar to give his thoughts.
Thank you for giving me the privilege of being with you today. I would like to make some comments from a slightly different perspective. So we have today an infrastructure pipeline of 100 lakh crores, and government has done its homework and it's announced its intention to begin implementation. with some degree of vigor. Government has also announced the setting up of a development financial institution to take care of some of the problems of long-term finance for such projects. And the template that was mentioned to by Srivastava earlier, that risk is taken over by one kind of lending, and once the construction risk is over, then other kind of money can flow in, which gets stable and assured returns. So I would like to draw attention to a slightly different and a medium-term perspective. And that medium-term perspective is that this century is all about the challenge of sustainability. And the foremost parameter which is now center stage is climate change and having a net carbon zero economy. Going beyond that is the whole issue of sustainability, living according to planetary boundaries, which is the resource available for India. The challenge is greater in terms of water and water availability and sustainable use of water. So I think the time has come when we look at this infrastructure pipeline or other projects from a medium-term strategic perspective of sustainability in terms of the first goalpost, which is net carbon zero, and the other goalposts of a circular economy, recycling, and especially recycling and using water. Now, if we bring in this medium-term perspective center stage, then how does it get translated into policy positions or decisions? And here the state plays a very important role because some of the infrastructure is done by the state itself out of its own monies, or it does public-private partnerships, but designs mechanisms which allow private investment to come in. Then the state can put in place policies and regulations which determine the decision-making matrix of a private investor who at the end of the day is looking at return on capital being reasonable and risk mitigation. So how does the state through policy instruments, regulatory instruments, laws, shift the decision-making matrix of private investors in a direction which supports sustainability over the medium term? Now, for infrastructure, this is very important because infrastructure investments are very long-term investments. And you get locked into these long-term investments. And then a constituency develops for preserving the commercial viability of those long-term investments, even though they run a little counter to the goals of a net carbon zero economy or a sustainable economy. So I think a far more detailed and I think technologically intensive discussion on the perspectives that need to come into analysis and policy discussion on infrastructure investments from the perspective of climate change and sustainability is required. And I do hope that starts getting greater and greater focus and more informed discussion. Now, to just give you an example, globally there is considerable discussion now on putting a stop for coal. And international funders are saying no more coal, we should wind down coal. Now we are at an inflection point where we can develop some more coal mines, do some more coal-fired stations, or take a view that maybe we need to pause and think afresh. Similarly, if one goes at the desire to enhance the gas economy. Now, since we don't have gas reserves, it means putting up LNG terminals, the whole distribution network for gas, etc. Now, gas is a fossil fuel. So Do we need to go that route, or can we leapfrog? What do those costs involve? What are the implications? A discussion on that is useful. In fact, this morning there is an article in the Times of India which talks of encouraging the use of electricity for cooking as one of the pillars of moving to net carbon zero, with the premise that electricity will gradually move towards freedom from the use of fossil fuels. So while India is at an early stage in its rollout of infrastructure compared to, say, China or the more mature economies, we therefore also have an opportunity to have a serious discussion and consideration of where we have strategic choices of leapfrogging or bypassing the trajectory taken by more advanced economies at an earlier stage of development. We've done this leapfrogging in, say, the use of smartphones, with most Indians never seeing a desktop or even a laptop, or we've done it with mobile phones earlier. So on infrastructure, a more informed and intelligent discussion on where are the opportunities of leapfrogging, what are the implications in the medium term, and what are the costs and policy choices. So I would certainly like to end by encouraging a greater discussion on these issues with a medium-term perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ajay Shankar. And now Kuljit.
Okay, thank you, Professor Raghuram. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my views with you. See, in my view, India is faced with a bit of a dilemma and a challenge because there was a time when sustainability, environmental impact, climate change, these issues did not matter. And when these issues did not matter, a lot of countries grew very rapidly from an economic perspective by taking decisions for which a lot of people are concerned today. But they grew economically. And I think India is suddenly discovering when it is its chance to grow, suddenly it's finding that sustainability and other things are being imposed, whereby all of this results in a certain cost. Whether on the economy or on the industry, somebody's paying that extra cost in the initial few years before sustainability actually becomes cost efficient. And what we are discovering now is that earlier sustainability used to be imposed by multilateral agencies. I think in the recent past, it has shifted to private investors. So I think Mr. Ajay Shankar was mentioning something about coal-fired projects not being in the good books of private investors. That's a big development. It was not the case earlier. Suddenly you find that even private investors are now imposing sustainability obligations on countries. And the last thing that is happening now is that even certain countries are imposing climate related obligations, sustainability related obligations on other countries. So for instance, the EU has come up with this very interesting carbon tax. And they are proposing that there will be a carbon tax which will be imposed on certain imports. And the genesis of that is they are saying, okay, fine, if we are imposing the sustainability limits on companies which operate within the EU, then if those same limits are not imposed on companies outside the EU, then the EU companies will be in an uncompetitive position. So that's an amazing thing. So now you will have cross-border adjustment mechanisms which will kick in, which India, if they want to export to those markets, will unfortunately have to go through those. So the external environment is suddenly very, very complex from an Indian perspective, just when it wants to grow, and that's a big challenge, I think. Now, from the Indian government's perspective, I think Indian government has been making a lot of efforts to promote sustainability. They have been coming up with a very, very large number of schemes. There has been a push on renewable energy. There was this PAT scheme which was imposed on a lot of industrial players. There was this Bureau of Energy Efficiency which got set up. EESL got set up. There are lots of reforms which are proposed for coal-fired projects because India is still generating more than 50% of the power from coal-fired projects. India is also toying with the idea of electric vehicles, for instance, getting the entire infrastructure in place, and making a lot of efforts to do things in water, which is the other major sector which is really impacted by sustainability. So government has been making a lot of efforts. But what we find in each of these schemes is that these schemes start with a certain objective. And then after some time, we discover that these schemes come up against certain speed bumps, which were not really envisaged at the time when these schemes were proposed. And then it takes a lot of time in India to actually remodel these schemes. For instance, if you see, the PAT scheme and the renewable energy scheme had two elements initially. One was REC trading and the other was energy certificates trading. And what you find is that both of these two mechanisms which were proposed, value of these, the economic value of these two mechanisms became so low that things really did not work out. Not to say that the PAT scheme and the renewable energy scheme did not work in India, it did work, but these two elements of these schemes kind of had a mixed response. Similarly, if you see, India has made huge strides in renewable energy. It's become one of the very, very hot markets globally. But now you suddenly find, talk to a lot of developers, the common complaint of developers is that suddenly you find that lots of tenders are happening in India, tenders are not getting signed, which is an amazing thing. India always had this issue of very, very high receivables, but now we have this issue of new PPAs getting signed. And third element which gets added is that there is an ambition in India now to have domestic manufacturing of equipment. And obviously this will have an impact on the renewable energy market development. So the scheme initially started very, very well. It made great strides, but suddenly it is faced with some speed bumps. Even in coal-fired projects, I think India did a lot of steps. They put these requirements for washing of coal, for FGD units to be installed. But you find that today, barring PSUs who are implementing FGD units, most private sector players are really not in a position to implement them. And there was talk of, globally, there is talk of carbon capture and storage mechanisms to address the issues in coal. But very recently, there is a global discussion which has been initiated, which basically says that if carbon capture and storage mechanisms are to be widely implemented, then what is the impact of these storage schemes? Well, the impact is that they will actually help the fossil fuel projects to be even more viable. So suddenly there is a question mark on carbon capture and storage schemes. And of course, in India, luckily, we have not had too much gas. And there is now talk of having more and more gas within the economy, whether that is used for firing your power projects, or whether that's in the form of CNG or PNG or LPG or whatever form. But I think what people are overlooking is that gas is the next coal actually, because gas is also a fossil fuel. So just like coal is a fossil fuel, gas is also a fossil fuel. So it may have a lower carbon intensity, but more and more, if you use it more and more, you will have some issues with yourself. The other thing which India has been doing quite extensively is government came out with a lot of policies for encouraging electric vehicles. There were these policies of FAME and other mechanisms which were put in place. But if you see the net impact of that today, I think what has happened is government expected that once it has set the policy, it will be private sector players who will do all the heavy lifting. Whether they in terms of development of technology, in terms of rollout of basic infrastructure like charging infrastructure, or even the manufacture of EVs, that hasn't really taken place. So today in India, you really do not have the basic infrastructure. In terms of technology, the technology in India from an EV perspective is really not the cutting edge technology. So overall, what you find is that sustainability is a big challenge for India as it struggles to grow. And it is going to add a cost. Government has been trying extensively for coming up with newer schemes to ensuring sustainability and reduction in climate impact. But all of those schemes have ended up having some speed bumps, which need to be rectified by the government at the earliest. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that in the Indian environment, when it comes to sustainability measurement, I think there is a need to have a mechanism whereby the human input gets minimized. Because in a country like India, if you have too much human intervention in measurement of sustainability, then there is always the possibility of the results being impacted. So India has to take a lot of inputs from what is happening globally. There are very, very high technology solutions which are being proposed. For instance, recently there is a proposal to have satellite imaging for methane emissions. So there are a lot of satellites which are there, which can actually pinpoint methane emissions from oil and gas industry to a radius of just about 30 meters. So that's a very, very high technology option which is available, and India needs to do more and more of those high technology options if they want to go ahead and have a very objective way of measuring these sustainability goals. So those were some of the points that I wanted to make. So thank you very much, Professor Raghuram.
Well, thank you all. I think we've sort of had a fairly broad sweep of issues between those with all this rich experience behind everybody. Let's just take a few questions from the audience. Yeah, so there's one question which says from Rahul Mehta, net zero is the new agenda being internationally protected by the US, and India has been opposing it so far. What should be our view, and especially in terms of the Paris Accord? Who would like to take this?
I can have a stab at it, and then others can join.
Okay, Anish, please.
Yes, sure. So net zero is not US. In fact, US has just come in with Biden, promising 50%, cuts in emissions. So that's a much more recent thing. Net zero is much more an European concept, and the European Union has committed that all its member countries will do within 2050 or even earlier. It will achieve net zero. Even China has committed to 2060. US has not made a formal commitment of a date yet, but it's working in the same direction because it's promised to sharply cut back emissions. Now, what are India's challenges? I think the fundamental challenge India has is that we are a growing economy, not a mature economy yet. Okay, so when you have growth, then you have energy requirements which are significant. And serving all those energy requirements from non-fossil fuels, or significant part of that from non-fossil fuels, is difficult. Okay, and also India has indigenous coal, which has to be, the idea is to use it in some form or fashion. So committing to net zero automatically means that you kind of start ruling out those options. But let's look at it from a practical standpoint. Today we have, if we look at the year 2040, we will have 129 gigawatts of thermal power plants, okay, which are less than 30 years of age. This is statistics I'm providing, 129 gigawatts. If you look at 2050, okay, you will not have anything which is less than 30 years of age, barring some things which Mr. Srivastava mentioned, that some things might come up in this thing, get resolved, and something, from that. Some minor stuff can come, because as we all have come to understand, new coal is practically unfinanceable. It's not financeable. So you won't have, by sheer numbers, you won't have 2050, you won't have anything. So I've been of the view that if we had to pick a year to say that let's go net zero, 2047, 100 years of independence is great. Okay, the optics are fantastic. And you actually have the thing solving out by itself, because you can't build any new coal-fired power plants. That's the reality of the matter. So why not try for that? Now, how do we do that? Even despite, and I know the demand side, growth of the demand side poses a problem, but how do we do that? Now, in terms of solar, okay, amount of sun, and 300, more than 300 sunny days, large sunny tracts in many parts of the country where they are not habitated. I know land acquisition and operational problems are there, but otherwise it is possible. Even distributed solar is a great potential in India, and we already are doing reasonably well. It's not that it is not there. So solar with the falling cost curves, large resources, you can do that. Storage today is expensive, but 5 years, give it 5 years, it will come. In fact, even within that time frame, hydrogen as a resource is going to come up much more strongly. So if you have all of these put as your strategy itself, then you are possibly going to work to that plan, which is going to go net zero with a 2047 or similar date. I mean, 2047 is very, very, relatable date because it's 100 years of experience in independence. On the contrary, if you don't do that and you waffle like we are doing in the waffling in the policy space, okay, then actually you end up possibly distracting the nation from the future and keep harping on those old age technologies which are not financeable. So, if I had to call out, I'm just saying that our policy should stop waffling, really call out that we want to go net zero and commit ourselves, because as a hardworking nation, industrious nation, we'll achieve it. But if our policy confuses us, then we have a problem. I mean, maybe it's an extreme view, but that's what it is.
Thank you. Yeah. Though, I always worry, even when we say renewable, I don't know today whether we have enough science. If I take away that solar energy and convert it to something else, wherever the sun by nature should have fallen and, and nourished the earth, I am in a way intervening, wind energy. I am intervening from now we may say it's a small share, but who knows, people have said that a small minute change in the earth's axis can create, major disturbances to the earth, let alone what humans are doing. So we don't understand nature, but, here we are discussing all this. So anyway, that's, I think, a question for which I'm not sure there's really an answer, but it's at least worth thinking about. So, okay, let me just take on another question, which is, so large infrastructure projects have an impact on the environment. One is, today, do we have ways, which gives us comfort that we can deal with it, or should it kind of lead us to stop thinking about such projects? I mean, I'm slightly rephrasing a question from Barka. Anybody? Yes, Mr. Shahi. You got to unmute.
Large infrastructure projects that we take, invariably, larger the project, more intensive is the study on environmental safeguards. I must tell you that this story was not narrated, should have been narrated. When 2013 or so, we had the devastation in Uttarakhand. The only entity which could save at least two large towns there is the TERI project, which is a large dam and a large hydro project, which was opposed for decades. And what created problem was the small projects which did not undergo such studies, the small hotels, the small inns, the small shops, they all collapsed because the budget in these would not be enough to undertake that type of intensive study on earthquake and other designs so that they can take care of the thing. So therefore, I think it is a myth and it is a wrong perception that large projects create devastation. Large projects, in fact, our safeguards, in fact, some of the time these development agencies feel a little more concerned whether our safeguards are on the higher side, but at least I feel that let there be on higher side, but let them be there. So I don't think this myth we should carry on. As I said, hydro projects have been decried everywhere. And today, when we have the solar system and point rightly raised, what is the backup? If we had been able to do larger number of hydro projects in the country, answer would have been there. In fact, in 2003, we launched a 50,000 megawatt hydroelectric initiative. Many of those projects have come, but a larger number have not come. I think we shoot in our own leg by all sorts of this misguided information discussion. Each time these subjects have been raised, we have talked to the people, but they get more misguided by very different types of perceptions than the real state of affairs. So it's wrong to say that large projects they may have the potential, but they are also associated with the required budget to address those requirements. So I think let's not get carried away by the other. But let me answer the first question also, which Anish mentioned, and I agree with him, that we are not agreeing with US. In fact, US has not agreed with us and with the whole world on many of the issues starting from Kyoto Protocol. India has been doing its bit. So let there be no, I mean, since young students are there participating, this institute does these programs, let there be no misunderstanding on this. Even today, there is no disconnect between what they say and what we are trying to do. Even our 475,000 megawatt of solar power that we are projecting by 2030, it might go to 2035. The other day, we had a very extensive discussion. Ajay Mathur, who is now the Director General of International Solar Alliance. And in that discussion, we had other presentations as well. It was pointed out, and I agree with that. But if we achieve this, we would have achieved more than what we have committed in the Paris Agreement. So I think some of us have been concerned that have we paced up the solar power a little more than we can cope with? Are we biting more than we can chew? Some of those concerns are coming. It is not that they are hollow concerns, may not be the right concerns, but there may be some weight in that. So I think let me address that point also, that if there is any perception that we are differing from, in fact, I was there, Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, and US we were one of the 18 countries which signed the charter. We are ahead. Then Zero Emission Future Gen project, we contributed to that. I think we have been going along, whatever international discussions are happening. Paris Agreement, slightly we diluted our stand of common but differentiated responsibility. Personally, I feel we need not have. My own view has been, and the government view has been, that India could do better than what it commits, but India could continue with the common but differentiated accountability. And that is per capita emission must remain there. Per capita emission, we are much, much, much less than the global average. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a interesting follow-up to this question, which is by Anish, framing it slightly differently. So since one of the themes that has emerged is to bring in a lot more local focus on developing infrastructure, in India, in terms of decision making, it still appears that even if we are doing local projects, it is top down. I mean, we can see that whether it's a metro project or a BRTS project, at least the lowest denominator often is the state, if not the center, through various incentives trying to drive it. Yeah. How do we empower the local administration, local governance to be able to think and execute these so that there is better alignment with the need and what is provided?
Yeah, so I'll cover a couple of things. I'll also borrow from what Mr. Srivastava said. So first thing is that this is a historical problem.
I'd like to give some opportunity to the other panelists.
I thought you were asking me. So no. My apologies.
Sorry, it's open, and maybe Mr. Ajay Shankar.
Let me come in on this. Yeah. You see, we had this path-breaking constitutional amendments about 30 years back, which were intended to empower the municipal bodies and the village panchayats. regrettably, the devolution of sufficient financial space to these bodies has not moved at the manner and at the pace at which it was envisaged. So what happens is that we have a lot of central schemes, a lot of state government schemes, which they implement, but the space to take their own decisions and implement schemes is not there. So the forward movement has to be greater devolution of finances to these bodies so they can decide and take decisions and choose their own priorities. Until that happens, we need another kind of framework, which is that there is some loose money with state governments as well as the central government. Now, this is a tall ask because both state governments and central governments are always short of fiscal resources. But some loose money, whereby if somebody comes up with an innovative idea from a village or from a municipal authority, and which is worth trying out, this gets implemented as a pilot project and it gets fully funded. Because then we will be able to get very innovative, practical pilot projects going in the country, which could then be scaled up very rapidly if they're well conceived. Today, we have a situation where a long debate takes place in Delhi or a state capital on the right design for a project, and then a sanction is issued and everybody is supposed to act accordingly. So we need to create a bit of space for things moving the other way up, that is from bottom up, and some financing for that, to begin with some loose money in state governments and central government, and gradually moving to greater devolution of finances to the local, as envisaged in the Constitution.
Thank you. Well, Anish, I'm sorry, I should actually, it is a question for you. I had read it as a question from, I thought somebody called Anish from the audience had raised the question. So please, would you like to add?
Very, very quickly, I think Mr. Shankar has covered it. It's a historical problem, because from the British times, the city administrations had been damaged because they were otherwise becoming hotbeds of political activism. So that was systematically damaged. We tried to undo that damage, but we haven't done the things. In fact, there is over-centralization of powers, as we sometimes talk about. So what will change is if we can create the templates, create high-quality bankable projects at that level, and put the right kind of human capacity to do that, then this will change. Now, that was the intent of the smart cities initially. It didn't happen that way. Okay, so, but with urbanization coming in this way, it's a huge, huge priority. Mr. Srivastava has a point to make.
Yeah, I think for micro projects, what Mr. Shankar and you are saying is all right, but when you're looking at larger projects, the point that I was making was that unless you have the stakeholder convergence across central, state, and local levels, you will have project impediments coming along. And one way to actually get them onto speed and get them ingrained into the project is to actually incentivize them for faster implementation. Given the fact that of the total projects, 31% is the cost due to time overruns. So there has to be some time value for the time of implementation. You can't have projects languishing from 1 month to 261 months behind schedule. So somewhere that capacity building will follow as a process. But what Mr. Shankar mentioned about the panchayat devolution, definitely at the local levels, I agree with him and Anish. But for the larger projects, we shouldn't have such situations where it's a partisan, it's not bipartisan, and therefore you will have a differential of implementing the infrastructure projects across the country through all the states. So that has been the main: land acquisition, environmental clearance, and utility. These are the three major factors which have delayed. At some point of time, we need to incentivize that faster implementation. And that's where we need to probably align the interests of the local heads.
There is a question also on, you had raised about, the development of financial institutions, the more sort of, but have we not actually over the years, in a sense, at least if I recall, even with the start of IL and FS, it was government that had initiated. So first IL and FS came, of course, today these, in whatever state they are in. Then came IDFC, Infrastructure Development Financing Company. Then came IIFCL. And now again, we are talking about a DFI. In fact, IDFC was supposed to be doing it, but over a period of time with the retail banking excitement, it sort of reversed its role. IAFCL, I know, was supposed to be a catalyst to enable banks to actually play the lead in syndicating, but with IAFCL providing something more to bring risks down. So it's not as though this idea of DFI in the infrastructure domain. So, are we going to just do one more because the earlier ones have somehow at some point deviated from their sort of primary focus? I mean, would Mr. Srivastava view on that?
No, sir. Actually, if you look at it in the earlier developing financial institutions, right from IFCI to ICICI, IDBI, IFCL or IDFC, they were set up in certain time frames where perhaps the economy was less mature and things could be managed. I'm using the term managed in a very positive sense. Now, as an immature economy and an immature democracies, we have our own challenges. And therefore, the projects that were coming, you have the economic benefits and you have your financial benefits and you have economic compulsions and you have political compulsions. Now, all these framework, somewhere the projects were not properly designed, were not properly implemented and not properly coordinated. And therefore, you got into a lot of payment risk, you got into a lot of NPA situations there. Now, this entire decade of 2008 to 2018 has been a decade of learning for the infrastructure sector. Now, approvals and clearances are not taken for granted. The banks will not finance unless all the boxes are ticked. They're insisting that the project design or the DPIs be done by professional bodies. They're insisting that the monitoring of the project be more robust. Yet we have not reached the standard we would like to reach as in the West. Perhaps it's time that under this DFI, which is on to promote and catalyze and also to actually create a sustainable ecosystem for project finance or infrastructure financing, I think it's a very comprehensive move which the government has done by identifying a set of heavy lifting projects. I think that is the next step. The third step they have identified is the need to create the institutions. We don't have the institutions. We don't have a professional body which can go into a detailed project and find out the risk. And more importantly, when you are talking about a project with a life cycle of say 25 to 50 years, you are envisioning the risk over the next 25 to 50 years. I'm telling you, with work from home, do we require commercial real estate? With video conferencing, with business travel, require airlines to have business classes. And there will be a lot of risk as we go along. So in our DPR or in our project cost estimates, do we provide the wiggle room to actually align risk with returns as we go along? Do we look at the infrastructure project over their entire life cycle of construction, then operationalization, aggregation, and then perhaps capital recycling? Different sources of finance will be required at different places. Now, that comprehensive structure has not yet evolved. So we are looking at disaggregated. Every ministry, every line department in the central government and the state government comes up with its own project parameters. And that has created a confusion. There are no standards on which actually we can check up on the quality. So if you look at the quality, while we are by road density, we are perhaps one of the highest in the world, second or third highest, but the quality of roads is much to be desired.
Yeah.
So somewhere,
I thought structures like am I right? Turnout, am I using the right word? Turnout financing, where you have the DFIs take on the high risk portion, and after that you get banks to come in to do the or the other way. I mean, whatever, whoever has an appetite for high risk but short tenor, and then once the risks have sort of gone away, the primary risks, then you go for the long tenor and with a different kind of financing. Of course, today with the asset monetization, I think in some sense, these are being addressed. Sorry. Yeah.
No, you're right, sir. You're right. You can take out financing. So
Take out financing. Yeah.
In the first stage of commissioning, that's where the risks were there and the risks were misallocated. So the land acquisition risk or the environmental clearances risk partly devolved onto the concessionaire. Now that needs to be allocated afresh. Now banks are not going to be taking those risks unless they have, mitigants are in place, and there is a payment mechanism for ensuring that these risks don't devolve onto them. So that's why initially I said that you'll have to divide infrastructure financing into one commission phase and one is operation phase.
Sure.
In the commission phase, again, if you have too many of participants, there's a practical mistake we made, that for every EPC project or every infrastructure project, we had 20 lenders. Now, coordinating those lenders, if there was some deviation from the original path, was a huge nightmare. You could never get 20 banks and the authority and the concessionaire to agree. Now that needs to be dovetailed.
Okay, I think we need to. So interesting issue of you want more people to share the risk, but then coordination costs, transaction costs go up.
No, the risk will be shared post-commissioning, sir. Post-commissioning, when it devolved onto a corporate bond or a InvIT structure, obviously the returns and the risk are shared. You have more number of people there.
Okay.
Mr. Ajay Shankar wants to make a point.
I'm going to come to Mr. Ajay Shankar, but let me first ask Kuljit on any of these points, because I'm going to close the discussion part and then move to summarizing. So Kuljit, is there something you wanted to say on any of the questions that had been raised? Because,
2 points on the lenders part. See, I think the reason why you have so many of these financial institutions getting created is that after some time you discover that these institutions have got into trouble. And that has happened historically, whether it was IFCI or any other entity that you see, they get into trouble after lending. Now, there are 2 things which we have noticed about Indian lenders where they are very flexible. See, one thing is that there is a tendency amongst Indian sponsors to fund their equity through debt. And I think the Indian lenders are less sensitive to this aspect. So to give you an example, in renewable energy space, you will find now every developer is an EPC contractor of his own projects. And if you ask them, do you actually have any expertise of doing EPC contracting? Actually, they don't. They are actually outsourcing the entire construction to someone else, but they are stepping in between those subcontractors and the lenders. And obviously the lenders are only too willing to go ahead with that. Similarly, in the highway space also, what you find is all construction companies are developers. There are hardly non-construction players who are into this. Once again, the Indian lenders are very, very flexible about this. And this leads to when the project goes down, I think suddenly the lenders discover that the equity margin which should protect them is actually not there. So that's one thing about the Indian lenders, which, as I said, they're highly flexible. I think the second thing which wrong-foots a lot of the lenders is these post-facto changes in government policy. So I'll give you an example. Lots of renewable energy projects came in Rajasthan, and they suddenly discovered that there is this very endangered bird in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, which is known as the Great Indian Bustard. Projects got awarded, people started putting in money, and suddenly they discovered that here is this endangered bird, and there was a new norm which is fixed by the government as to how to deal with that. And suddenly you discovered that if you were in that danger zone, your projects were not really workable. So if you spent any money, then that is probably, not going to be recoverable. Similarly, if I look at coal-fired projects, there was some time back, there was a policy of go and no-go areas in coal mining, which came out of the blue, and then it disappeared. Then there was this FGD norm, which came in 2014, I think it came in 2014, and in 2021 also it's not got implemented, but it is there. So what has happened is the second thing which is wrong-footing a lot of the lenders is these post-facto government policies, which makes a lot of projects unviable, not because they have not done their diligence. They've actually their mind done their diligence, but they are wrong-footed by the government itself. So I think the need for institutions because of these 2 reasons in India.
So the issue of subsequent regulation, not only environmental, sometimes even non-environment driven, has affected many, many projects. But a quick word to Mr. Ajay Shankar, and then we'll...
And Mr. Shahi, Kuljit and I, we were party to an innovation which needs replication, which is creating a project-specific SPV for a big infrastructure project, which is, does the land acquisition, gets the environment clearance, does all the risk mitigation of the pre-execution stage, so that the agency which comes in has all these environmental risks in terms of regulations, etc., mitigated, and they take over only the construction risk. So the results were extraordinary. The prices we got were far better than we expected. So that could well be replicated for a major portion of the large pipeline of projects in the infrastructure pipeline, which is a project-specific SPV, which does all the preliminary work and then is taken over by the actual developer through a transparent process. I think that needs to be, brought center stage again. And the three of us were fortunate to having done the first big one, 4,000 megawatts, 16,000 crores investment in ultra mega power projects.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to come back to all of you after a brief set of issues that I think, I can crystallize, to ask each of you one suggestion to go back to the theme of the conference, because the conference says infrastructure, of course, theory, practice, and policy. So behind theory, practice, and policy, I like to believe there are actors. So there are academics, there are practitioners, and there are policy makers. So I would want each one of you to just give one actionable way forward for each of these persons. Okay, and I'll just do a round after a few minutes. Okay, so what I think has come up, again, wonderful sweep of issues. So one is infrastructure by itself, of course, is incomplete. It has always got a service top up. And unless we think of it in an integrated way, we don't do well. And that service, the way I look at it is there are three dimensions, which I think came through in the discussions and in earlier keynote talks and so on. So first is access. Whether it is telecom or power, as it was pointed out, we had an access measure that if you had one lamp within some distance of a village, or what is defined as a village, then we said the village was electrified until we have had to redefine it further. So we have access measures, which simply helps us tick off. Now, as we move beyond access, we have to go to capacity measures. Look, do we have a sense of the demand? And am I actually catering to the demand? But that again is not enough in India. Because now power sector, for example, in many places we say yes, but there is another level, which is quality. Do I have quality power? I mean, in this very conference, we've had issues where a speaker had to stop midway because the power went off in Goa or power went off somewhere. And, so we don't have, so there is access, there is capacity, and then there is quality. I mean, we can see that in telecom. We said, look, some access is fine. Then we've sort of gone on to capacity. Now, actually, we were overstretching our capacity, that quality is suffering. Calls getting dropped. So everywhere, at least to me, conceptualizing it, infrastructure needs to address not only access, but capacity and quality. So that's one point that comes in. I think the issue of differential risks at the construction stage and at the operation stage. And I think today that we see different structures emerging, which seems to try to recognize that. Of course, before all that is a need for good design and planning, because unless we have good design and planning, then we can construct and do the operations. Of course, I would just bring in the issue of subsequent regulation that has many times affected this design that we have put in place. A third issue was that of institutions. Of course, the current discussion is on the development financial institutions, but I think we also went on to looking at the idea of special purpose vehicles that could be sector oriented. So umbrella SPVs, for example, in railways, there is an RVNL that tries to do certain address umbrella issues. And then, of course, you have SPVs that are project specific, that then handle the risks and the financing and the construction and operation specific to a project, while we have an umbrella SPV that in some ways tries to address more common issues. So maybe, there are different structures that emerge, again, depending on different domains. I also saw that sustainability in many ways, the primary sector or the primary domain that seems to connect with sustainability is energy. Though, I'd like to believe that transportation also has issues of sustainability, telecom has issues of sustainability. Of course, housing is coming in as an important issue. And when I say transportation, I mean, not only the expressways and the 4-laning, 6-laning, but right down to the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which in many ways is subject to that access, capacity and quality paradigm. Are we only considering access? And what is the definition of access when we say a village is ticked off as connected, and so on? So, and I can give you many examples of where that, okay. Finally, I think also taking off from one of the questions that somebody had asked me directly, what about demand management? And in fact, are we falling into a trap when we define a $5 trillion economy that we want to achieve, and parameters of what constitutes better quality of life? Are we, in a sense, caught up in a paradigm that was evolved by countries at a time when sustainability was not such a big issue? And that has defined development and economy. Whereas in India, still today, pedestrian intensity, maybe in many parts, bicycle intensity, or low fuel motorized vehicles like two-wheelers, including in rural areas, to achieve that particular purpose, rather than obviously use a car. If you're using a motorcycle to achieve the same purpose, you're much better. So now, of course, India is aspirational. Many times I'm told that people are doing this because they don't have a choice. Whereas abroad, now the next generation says, no, I don't want to own a car. I'd rather use public transit. But in India, we have not gone through where people have had the luxury of choice. And then they say, yes, I don't want to own a private vehicle. Whereas we've not even given them that aspiration. Or can we bring a cultural shift to do demand management where we skip this motorized transport intensity, we skip this high energy intensity that countries have gone through. We are at a lower energy intensity, and can we still give ourselves a quality of life that we need to have? Should we be looking at different parameters? Should we get the entire polity in India thinking differently? I mean, of course, just to go back to what Gandhi or some other people have said, there is enough for people's need, but may not be for people's greed. So, what defines economic development, I think, and how can we sort of do something about that? So I'm just going to leave it at, these are some thoughts that I'm taking away. And, it's been a great discussion. So let me come back to each one of you, just give you, I want one suggestion, the top of the mind that you have for the three, and let's go in the sequence of, personally, I feel maybe look at the practitioner, people who are actually doing infrastructure, then look at the policymaker, who's sort of enabling, regulating, and then let's look at the academic who's got to provide, a thought leadership behind this. So I will go through the same sequence. I've already alerted all of you, so hopefully we can do this quick. So let me start with Mr. Shahi. So basically three statements. Yeah.
I think you have given a very good perspective. Of course, I think we have to go a little more before we come to the conclusion that we can be self-contented with whatever we have, because we have not reached that stage yet. We need to have better consumption of electricity. It is unfortunate. This type of paradox you won't have many places, that we have 1200 kilowatt hour per head per year. We are refusing to increase, even though we have capacity to provide that extra. You mentioned about access, you mentioned about capacity, or you mentioned about quality. Now, this is totally mismanagement. We are not managing, and therefore we have today. We didn't have. 20 years back, we didn't have. Today we have, and we are nowhere. So that's and since this is the most fundamental of the infrastructure, because this is at the core of everything, this should be a cause of concern, and one should be thinking about. I would feel that if one factor has to be addressed very adequately, particularly with reference to the development of rural India, I think capacity building is most important. Capacity building in administration, capacity building in project execution, capacity building in financial development financing, some of the issues that have come up. So I think capacity building, if we analyze wherever we go wrong and wherever we have not been able to move forward positively, somewhere at the core of the thing has been a lack of real competence and real capacity building. So, number one point with reference to your overall premise, I think we need to go further.
So my takeaway is you're saying capacity building, capacity building, capacity building.
Capacity building, yeah.
Let the practitioners need capacity building, policy making, there needs to be capacity building, and academics have to think about and contribute to capacity building.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Anish.
Yes, so I'll emphasize three things which we have talked about through the day. First is to, again, as I said, build resilient infra which will serve the test of time, and that involves two parts. One is the planning and design phase, which has to be very different, and then the execution and the quality of execution, which we have talked about. Now, this will mean many things, including capacity building, but planning and design and execution to build resilient infra. That's first theme. The second theme is sustainable infra, not just resilient, but sustainable, both in terms of
only I'm requesting whether we can target our statements to the potential actor. The actors are practitioners, policymakers, and academicians.
Okay. So first on resilient infra is a lot towards the practitioners.
Okay.
Okay. On sustainable infra, that is towards the policymakers.
Okay.
Okay. And the human-oriented infra, which I call user-oriented infrastructure, which is what you were talking about. That's something the academia has to work a lot more on, because we otherwise focus on the supply side, not the demand side of the equation.
Thank you very much. I would request Mr. Srivastava.
No, I couldn't agree more with Mr. Shahi. Capacity building is really the requirement, and while 5 trillion appears to be a stretch, but aspirational, but it is not impossible. And I would say that sustainable ecosystem for infra financing by developing the institutions, global standard institutions, and a regulatory framework is necessary, which means, in effect, what Mr. Machai mentioned, capacity building across the value chain.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ajay Shankar.
First, a preliminary observation, which is that we need infrastructure way, way ahead of demand to achieve our development potential. We have been remiss in trying to anticipate demand accurately, and infrastructure has been trailing demand. A related point is that we live in a globalized world. So if you look at the rich Indian, his per capita consumption is at par with his wealthy counterparts in the US. So to think of having a different kind of lifestyle of the Gandhian kind is unrealistic in today's globalized world. Now coming to the substantive comment, I think government needs to get greater depth and better coordination on the issue of infrastructure, because the problem is that it's spread across many ministries and we need greater cohesion, greater policy consistency, better risk mitigation, etc., etc. So government needs to do a lot more work and do it much better if we are to succeed in achieving our infrastructure needs, meeting our infrastructure needs in a short period of time, and infrastructure not constraining our growth potential.
Thank you. And finally, Kuljit.
Okay. In my view,
I guess you're moving. So the
yes,
connectivity.
I'm in the car. Sorry, that's why I have a.
Yeah.
Sorry. So basically, one of the things which is is
I think he has an infrastructure issue.
Thing that if you do Ministry X and say that Ministry Y has done this, it's a great practice. Why don't you follow it? Say no. Within the government, what you will discover is
Okay, I think
that was a fitting finale to the.
Yes. Absolutely. You see, I mean, you can talk about telecom and IT and mobility, and you still, quality is concerned.
Sustainable infrastructure.
Yeah. So I think we will stop here, and I've already overshot my time for the organizers. So thank you very much, and I hope we will be able to crystallize enough takeaways for the practitioner towards practice, for the policymaker towards policy, and theory, thought leadership for the academic, which is what Adani Institute is, in a sense, trying to do. And I think one the word capacity building, of course, is a common theme that runs right across. So, yeah, with that, thank you very much, and
thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ajay. Anish, after a long time.
Yes, indeed.
Srivastava, all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good evening to all. Truly, it was quite a diverse and enriching discussion. We have learned that, in spite of many advancements, our physical as well as social infrastructure is getting badly affected by very aggressive climatic variations. Therefore, future projects should not only be in tune with these changes, but also take into consideration and give importance to convergence of all stakeholders. We also came to know that efforts are being made by the Indian government, but they are still not catching up with the efforts made by other governments and countries, like promoting e-vehicles or implementing strict carbon tax. Therefore, even though India is moving in the right direction, it needs to quicken its pace. Here, I would like to take an opportunity to thank all our stellar panelists, like Mr. Avi Shahi, Mr. Ajay Shankar, Mr. Anish, Mr. Kuljeet Singh, Mr. Sunil Srivastava, and the very passionate moderator, Professor G. Raghuram, who helped us in making us aware of the actual gaps in planning, policy, and implementation processes as we are all desperately aiming for the sustainability. Moving forward, I would like to invite our director, Professor A.B. Thomas, who helped us in meeting many timelines for the conference. Sir, I request you to do the honors of announcing the Best Paper Award in all tracks. Over to you, sir.